In the autumn of 1919, a 30-year-old man with no steady job, no home of his own, no university degree, wrote a letter to his military superior in Munich answering a question about the so-called Jewish question. It was not just any letter. In that text, Adolf Hitler established the difference between what he called emotional anti-Semitism and rational anti-Semitism. The former, he said, produced only sporadic pogroms. The second was to produce something more definitive, the total elimination of the Jews from German life. He signed it on September 16, 1919. It was 14 years before he became Chancellor, 23 for Europe to lose 6 million people. When most historians study Hitler's anti-Semitism, they labeled it for decades as the delusion of a lunatic. This interpretation, although emotionally understandable, fractures the analysis. Germany in the 1920s and 1930s was considered the most intellectually advanced nation in the Western world. Its universities trained the best scientists on the planet. His philosophical culture was envied throughout the continent. How could a deranged person without coherence have dragged that people towards a systematic and methodically planned genocide? The awkward answer is that Hitler was not an unargued lunatic. He was a man with a perfectly articulated ideology, logically consistent within his own premises, and devastatingly persuasive to a society already burdened with centuries of prepared hatred. What Hitler saw in the Jews was not simply a religious minority or even an inferior race that deserved contempt. That set him apart from the conventional anti-Semites of his time. To him, the Jews represented something infinitely more dangerous. They were the very source of the ideas that, according to him, were destroying the natural laws of humanity. Judaism, in his eyes, had introduced into the world a conceptual poison so profound that it threatened the survival of all civilization. This was not a visceral rage, it was a cosmic mission that he considered to be backed by the immutable laws of nature. This script explores, with historical rigor and without condescension towards the audience, the origin, structure, and consequences of that ideology. Not to understand it with sympathy, but because what is not understood cannot be fought, and what cannot be fought tends to return. Braunau am Inn, on the border between Austria and Germany. A small, prosperous city with cobbled streets and bourgeois houses with colorful facades. Adolf Hitler was born in that city on April 20, 1889, the fourth child of Alois Hitler, a customs official of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Clara Polzel, his third wife, 23 years his junior. Hitler's childhood was nomadic due to bureaucratic imposition. Alois changed destinations regularly, from Braunau to Passau, from Passau to Leonding on the outskirts of Lintz. For young Adolf, each move meant new schools, new fights, new hierarchies to conquer. He was a bad student in almost everything except drawing and gymnastics. His teachers described him as stubborn, temperamental, incapable of submitting to authority. When Alois died in January 1903, his father's pressure disappeared, and Adolf, at the age of 14, definitively abandoned any pretense of completing his studies. One of his teachers at the Realschule in Linz described him years later as notoriously quarrelsome, willful, arrogant, and ill-tempered, lacking in self-discipline, incapable of working in a team. What no one pointed out with sufficient emphasis is that anti-Semitism entered Hitler's life well before Vienna. His childhood friend in Linz, August Kubizek, would remember years later that Alois Hitler Sr. was a follower of Georg von Schönerer, the pan-Germanist leader of Austria, known precisely for his racial anti-Semitism. Kubizek claimed that Hitler in 1904, while still a teenager, regularly read the Linzer Fliegende Blatter, a local anti-Semitic newspaper. At the Realschule in Linz, where he studied, several professors had openly anti-Jewish ideas. In those same Linz years, Hitler discovered Richard Wagner. He went to the opera for the first time at the age of 12 and was struck down. Wagner was not only Hitler's favorite composer throughout his life, he was also an ideologue. In his essay Das Judentum in der Musik, first published in 1850 under a pseudonym and then under his own name in 1869, he argued that Jews could not genuinely create because they lacked roots in a national tradition. For Wagner, Jews were imitators, parasites of Aryan culture. Hitler absorbed this not as entertainment but as truth. Years later, he would write that anyone who wanted to understand National Socialist Germany should know Wagner. At 16, Lintz was too small for the ambitions of the young Hitler. He dreamed of Vienna and the fine arts, the city that shone on the other side of the hill, the city that was going to change everything. And so it was, just not in the way he expected. October 1907. 18-year-old Adolf Hitler arrives in Vienna with his folders of drawings under his arm and his aspiration to become a painter. The Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna was the most prestigious institution in the German-speaking world for the visual arts. Hitler took the entrance exam with a folder that included mainly architectural landscapes and buildings, technically correct pieces but devoid of life. It was rejected. He tried again the following year. This time he was not even admitted to the test. The commission considered that his aptitudes aimed more at architecture than painting, but to enter the Academy's School of Architecture, a complete baccalaureate was required, which Hitler did not have. The rejection was humiliating. But what Vienna did with that resentful boy was something much deeper than denying a dream. The city of Freud and his theories on sexuality, of the composer Gustav Mahler, of the painter Gustav Klimt and his erotic canvases that scandalized conservatives, was the capital of the press, most influential liberal on the continent. It was a city that dared to question everything that Hitler considered sacred: tradition, hierarchy, Germanic cultural purity. Modernism invaded everything, and Vienna had 200,000 Jews among its 2 million inhabitants. They accounted for 10% of the population, but a much larger proportion of their doctors, lawyers, writers, journalists, and theater directors. This was no accident. Jewish communities had historically invested disproportionately in education precisely because intellectual professions were the least dependent on land ownership, from which Jews had been excluded for centuries. The visible result, in turn-of-the-century Vienna, was an attention-grabbing Jewish cultural presence. Hitler arrived with the prejudice learned at home and at school, but it was in the streets of Vienna's first and second arrondissements that this prejudice coagulated into ideology. Walking one day through the old center, he came across a man in a long black frock coat and dark ringlets. "Is that a Jew?" was his first reaction, according to his own description in Mein Kampf. The Jews he had seen in Lintz had assimilated so much that they looked like ordinary Germans. Not this one. This was an Eastern Jew, a religious Jew, and his appearance proved to be a revelation to Hitler. He bought the first anti-Semitic pamphlets of his life. He found them unsatisfactory, too crude, too unscientific. But he kept looking. He began reading Ostara, a publication by the eccentric occultist and racist Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, available at Vienna's tobacco kiosks. Lanz described human history as an eternal struggle between blonde Aryan heroes and ape men of inferior races, and the symbol he used for the former was the swastika. In 1907, the same year Hitler arrived in Vienna, Lanz hoisted the swastika over his castle at Burg Werfenstein in northern Austria. Hitler bought the publication regularly between 1907 and 1910. In 1909, he personally sought out Lanz to obtain back issues. Lanz gave them to him, flattered. But Hitler's greatest intellectual teacher in those years was not Lanz. He was Guido von List, a pan-Germanist occultist who found in the pre-Romanist Germanic runic symbols the key to an ancestral Aryan wisdom. And behind List and Lanz there was a figure of greater intellectual weight. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the English writer who had adopted Germany as his homeland and whose work Die Grundlagen des 19. Jahrhunderts, the foundations of the 19th century, published in 1899, had become the reference text of cultured Germanic racism. Kaiser Wilhelm II distributed it as a Christmas present. Alfred Rosenberg, who would be the official ideologue of the Nazi Party, studied it in depth and summarized it so that Hitler could access his arguments without reading it directly. Chamberlain maintained that all European history was the history of a struggle between the Germanic Aryan race the source of all creativity and civilization, and Judaism, the source of all that corrupted and disintegrated. Hitler's Viennese years were not just about reading. They were years of wandering the streets hungry. After spending his modest inheritance and orphan's pension, Hitler ended up living in a homeless hostel in the Meldemannstrasse. He made a living painting postcards of Viennese scenes that he sold with the help of a homeless man named Reinhold Hannisch until they had an altercation. He lived for 4 more years in the same marginalization before moving to Munich in May 1913. There was, however, a politician in Vienna who taught him something that Lantz and Chamberlain could not: how to turn anti-Semitism into power. Karl Lueger, mayor of the city from 1897 to 1910, led the Christian Social Party with pragmatic mastery. He was an anti-Semite of convenience. In private, he had Jewish friends and boasted, "Wer Jud ist, das bestimme ich," who is Jewish, I decide. But at rallies, he set the masses on fire with systematic anti-Jewish rhetoric. Lueger showed Hitler something he never forgot: that anti-Semitism was not just a personal belief. It was an extraordinarily effective political tool for mobilizing frustrated, frightened people who were looking for a simple explanation for complex problems. Hitler, when he left for Munich in May 1913, was no longer a confused young man. He was a convinced anti-Semite who carried with him the racial arguments of Chamberlain, the occult views of Lantz, and the political lesson of Lueger. He lacked only the war to finish forging what would become an unprecedented destructive ideology. Before continuing with Hitler, one must understand the soil in which his ideology grew, because Hitler did not invent German anti-Semitism. He inherited it, he systematized it, he elevated it to state policy, but the harvest was from seeds sown over generations. Modern German anti-Semitism emerged from the confluence of 2 distinct sources: medieval Christian anti-Semitism, which survived in popular customs and prejudices, and German ethnic nationalism that was born as a response to Napoleonic humiliation. The defeat by France at the beginning of the 19th century forced the Germans to seek their identity not in political institutions, but in culture, blood, and soil. And the Jew, who had just obtained emancipation under Napoleonic laws, became the perfect antagonist of that newly constructed identity. In 1879, Wilhelm Marr, a Berlin journalist who attributed his professional failures to the Jewish conspiracy, published the pamphlet Der Sieg des Judentums über das Germanentum, The Victory of Judaism over Germanism. The text was an immediate success, 12 editions in 6 years. Marr not only coined the term anti-Semitism in that text, but presented it as a racial and not a religious movement, definitively separating the hatred of the Jew from the hatred of Judaism. It was no longer a question of converting them. It was a matter of recognizing that the very nature of the Jew was incompatible with the German nation. In the same year, Heinrich von Treitschke, one of the most respected historians at the University of Berlin, published a series of articles in which he coined the phrase that would resonate for decades: Die Juden sind unser Unglück, the Jews are our misfortune. When a professor of that authority uttered those words, anti-Semitism ceased to be the opinion of marginal fanatics and became an academically respectable position. Heinrich Claas, one of the most influential anti-Semitic leaders of the next generation, would write that that phrase became part of my body and soul when I was in my 20s and essentially influenced my later political work. In the autumn of 1880, the so-called anti-Semitic petition began to circulate, initiated by 2 school teachers and distributed with the help of student organizations. When it was presented to Bismarck in April 1881, it had 225,000 signatures, mostly from Prussia, with 9,000 from Bavaria. About 4,000 university students had signed it. The petition called for the restriction of Jewish immigration, the exclusion of Jews from public office, and the restoration of Christian character in schools. Bismarck refused to act on it, but the mobilization it represented was unequivocal. In 1887, Otto Bockel became the first anti-Semitic deputy elected to the Reichstag with his slogan, "Free yourselves from Jewish intermediaries." It represented poor Hessian peasants who saw Jewish moneylenders and merchants as the cause of their economic misery. In 1892, he was followed by Hermann Alward, a schoolteacher who came to the Reichstag calling the Jews cholera bacilli and calling for their expulsion from the country. That same year, the Conservative Party, the most prestigious in Imperial Germany, revised its program to include the explicit statement, "We fight against the multiform and obstructive Jewish influence that corrupts the lives of our people." It was no longer an extremist position, it was ordinary politics. By the first decade of the 20th century, there were about 430 anti-Semitic associations and about 700 anti-Semitic newspapers in Germany. The student organizations of the universities were overwhelmingly anti-Semitic. In the Berlin student elections of 1921, 2/3 of the votes went to anti-Semitic candidates. The poison was everywhere, so normalized that it was no longer visible. When Hitler arrived in Munich in 1913, he was in his 20s and carried with him a hatred that he had not invented. He had already received it chewed up, catalogued, and presented as science and politics. The First World War accelerated everything. In mid-1916, as the war began to go awry, the Imperial Army bowed to anti-Semitic pressures and ordered a religious census of the armed forces. A tally of how many Jews served at the front, how many in the rear guard, and how many worked in the war industries. The insinuation was clear: the Jews were not doing their part. The census was a propaganda failure for anti-Semites because the results showed a Jewish turnout proportional to the population, with 12,000 Jews killed in combat and 100,000 serving in the army. But the results were never officially published, and the legend of Jewish cowardice and sabotage in the war continued to circulate. Hitler, who spent those years as a messenger on the Western Front, absorbed that narrative as his own. August 1914. The declaration of war was read at Munich's Odeonsplatz before a crowd singing hymns and waving flags. A photograph rescued decades later shows Hitler in the crowd, his eyes bulging with excitement and his mouth open. 2 days later, he petitioned King Ludwig III of Bavaria to voluntarily join a Bavarian regiment. It was granted. For Hitler, the war was the best thing that had happened to him in his life. For the first time, I had an identity, a purpose, a community. He served in the 16th Reserve Infantry Regiment, the so-called List Regiment, named after its first commander, as a messenger between headquarters and the front. This charge kept him generally away from the trenches, though not entirely safe. In October 1914, in its first major action at Ypres, Belgium, the regiment suffered devastating losses. Out of 3,600 men, only 611 remained. Even so, Hitler did not give up. He was wounded in the left thigh in October 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. He received the Iron Cross Second Class in December 1914 and in August 1918 the Iron Cross First Class, a distinction rarely awarded to someone of his rank of corporal. In October 1918, a British mustard gas attack at Vervik near Ypres temporarily blinded him and sent him to a military hospital in Passwalk, northern Germany. There in that hospital, slowly recovering from blindness, Hitler received the news of the armistice on November 9, 1918. He also heard that Bavaria had proclaimed a socialist republic under the leadership of Kurt Eisner, a Jewish journalist from Berlin who led the revolution that overthrew the Wittelsbach monarchy. Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated. The German Empire had collapsed. The war for Hitler had ended not on the battlefield but in a betrayal. This was the genesis of the myth that would define German politics in the following years, the Dolchstoßlegende, the legend of the stab in the back. According to this narrative, the German army was never defeated militarily. He was betrayed by the politicians, the socialists, the communists, and the Jews who had signed the armistice from home. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, appearing before the Parliamentary Commission investigating the causes of the defeat in November 1919, publicly endorsed this version when he declared that the army had been stabbed in the back by internal forces. It was a convenient lie. The High Command itself had already recognized in September 1918 that the military situation was untenable and had asked the civilian government to request an armistice, precisely so that the army would not have to bear the responsibility of the army. Failure. But the truth was not comfortable, and it was not disseminated. Hitler and millions of Germans with him decided to believe in treason with quasi-religious fervor. The years that followed only compounded the resentment. The Treaty of Versailles of June 1919 imposed devastating conditions on Germany. Loss of 13% of its territory, including Alsace-Lorraine, the eastern territories that became the new Poland, and the Saar under the administration of the League of Nations. Loss of 10% of its population, loss of all its colonies divided between France, Great Britain and other powers, reduction of the army to 100,000 men, prohibition of having military aviation, and Article 231, the famous war guilt clause, which made Germany responsible for all the damages of the conflict. Reparations were set in 1921 at 132 billion gold marks, an amount that economists considered impossible to pay without destroying the German economy. John Maynard Keynes, who had attended the peace conference as a British economic advisor, published The Economic Consequences of Peace that same year, denouncing the conditions as unworkable and predictive of a new war. The Weimar Republic, proclaimed in November 1918, was born marked by these conditions. In its early years, it was shaken by brutal political violence. The Spartacist uprising of January 1919, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, both murdered by the paramilitary Freikorps that the Social Democratic government used to suppress it, the Kapp putsch of March 1920, when the military right attempted its own coup. And in 1923, the year of maximum instability, hyperinflation reached levels that today seem surreal. A kilo of bread cost more than 100 billion marks in November 1923. The middle class saw their life savings disappear. Wages were paid twice a day so that workers could spend the money before it lost its value. In that breeding ground, a propaganda publication became the reference text to explain everything that was happening. The first German translations of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion began circulating in 1919, and by the end of 1920 they had sold 120,000 copies. A Jewish journalist who attended meetings on the text in Berlin that year wrote, "The speaker was usually a professor, a teacher, an editor, a lawyer, or someone of that kind. The audience consisted of members of the educated class, civil servants, shopkeepers, former officers, ladies, especially students. Passions were stirred to the boiling point." The text was a forgery made by the Tsarist secret police at the end of the 19th century, a plagiarism of a French satirical political novel of 1864. The Times of London newspaper proved it to be a forgery in August 1921, but by then it was too late. Alfred Rosenberg, the Baltic emigrant who came to Munich fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, brought the text with him as gospel and introduced it into the city's nationalist circles. Munich, September 1919. Hitler is 30 years old and works as an information agent for the army, infiltrating political groups to identify Marxist influences. One day that month, he received an assignment from his superior in the press and propaganda section of the district military command to respond in writing to the letter of a certain Adolf Gemlich, who asked for clarification on the Jewish question. The letter that Hitler wrote on September 16, 1919, is the oldest document that exists where he articulates his anti-Semitic ideology in a systematic way. In it he writes, "Anti-Semitism as a political movement cannot and should not be determined by emotional factors, but on the contrary by the recognition of facts." The facts he describes are that Judaism is a race, not a religious community, that Jews pursue money and power above all else, who dominate the press and falsify it, and that its influence acts as racial tuberculosis of the peoples. And he concludes with a sentence that carries, seen from the other side of Auschwitz, an unbearable weight. Their ultimate goal must invariably be the total elimination of the Jews. This letter reveals something fundamental. Hitler was not a visceral anti-Semite who acted on emotional impulse. He considered himself the representative of an enlightened anti-Semitism based on arguments distinguished from popular and crude hatred. This pretense of rationality did not make him any less dangerous. He did it infinitely more. The anti-fanatic who reasons is more persuasive than the fanatic who shouts. At the core of Hitler's ideology was the vision of the world as a permanent battlefield between two radically incompatible principles. The first was the law of nature, survival of the fittest, natural selection applied not only to biological species but to human races and civilizations. The second was what Hitler called the Jewish idea, the doctrine that every human being has intrinsic value, that the weak deserve protection, that universal brotherhood is possible and desirable. This was not a dichotomy that Hitler invented. It was a dichotomy that he found formulated in different words in the social Darwinist ideology that permeated European thought at the end of the 19th century. Ernst Haeckel, the German biologist who popularized Darwin, had argued as early as the 1870s that the principles of natural selection should be applied to social policy, that Western civilization made a fatal mistake in protecting the weak, the sick, and the incapable, because in doing so it interfered with the natural mechanism of improvement of the species. What Hitler did was to take these ideas, already present in the intellectual discourse of his time, and add to them a protagonist and an antagonist, the Aryan as an agent of natural law, the Jew as a subverter of that law. On August 13, 1920, at a public meeting of the German Workers' Party in Munich, Hitler gave a speech entitled, "Why Are We Anti-Semitic?" The text was preserved in a police report and published in subsequent investigations. It was the first complete public exhibition of his system of ideas, even before Mein Kampf. In it, following the anti-Semitic tradition of his time, he argued that Jews viewed work as a curse, maliciously citing the biblical verse, "You shall earn your bread by the sweat of your brow," as evidence that Judaism considered work a punishment. But more important than this economic argument was the political conclusion he drawn. The solution to the Jewish problem requires the elimination of the Jews from our nation, not because we would wish to deny them their existence. We congratulate the rest of the world on their company, but because the existence of our own nation is 1,000 times more important than that of a foreign race. Elimination, not conversion as in the Middle Ages, not segregation like the moderate anti-Semites of his time, total elimination. To understand why Hitler's anti-Semitism had an intellectual impact on people who were not simply brutish or ignorant, one must understand the scientific and intellectual context of the early 20th century. Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. His theory of natural selection transformed biology and was quickly extrapolated, often incorrectly, to human social organization. Herbert Spencer, the English philosopher, coined the expression survival of the fittest in 1864 to describe the Darwinian process, and applied it to human societies. In Germany, Ernst Haeckel developed a particularly aggressive version of social Darwinism that included explicit racial hierarchies and argued that advanced societies made a mistake by allowing the weak to survive and reproduce. But the most important intellectual figure in the chain leading to Hitler is the French Count Arthur de Gobineau, whose Essai sur l'inégalité des races humaines, published between 1853 and 1855, constituted the first systematic argument that human history was the history of races and that the white Aryan race represented the pinnacle of human evolution. Gobineau's work was not translated into German for 4 decades, but when it was, it found an audience already prepared by Völkisch nationalism. In 1894, the Gobineau Society was founded in Germany to spread his ideas. His godparents included the Wagner family, and the Alldeutscher Verband, the Pan-German League, became a member of the society. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Anglo-German who published the foundations of the 19th century in 1899, took Gobineau's framework and refined it. In his view, the entire history of Western civilization was the history of the struggle between two principles, the Aryan creative, spiritual, capable of building lasting civilizations, and the Semitic, materialistic, corrupting, incapable of creating but perfectly capable of destroying. Chamberlain added a crucial element that Gobineau had not developed: the connection between Judaism as a religion and Judaism as a race, and the assertion that the Jewish danger could not be combated by conversion because it was a matter of blood, not belief. The work was read with enthusiasm by the Kaiser, recommended by Wagner in his circle in Bayreuth, and was an essential part of the ideological education of the generation that would make German politics in the 20s. Alfred Rosenberg read it in its entirety. And Rosenberg was the one who introduced Hitler to that intellectual universe when they both met in Munich in the early years of the Nazi Party. Arthur Rosenberg had fled Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, bringing with him the protocols and a worldview in which Bolshevism was the most recent political expression of the Jewish conspiracy for world domination. It was he who convinced Hitler that the conquest of Russia and the elimination of Bolshevism were actually the same goal: to eliminate Jewish power over Russia and seize the Lebensraum that Germany needed. What Hitler did with all this material was to synthesize it into a total cosmology. He did not take social Darwinism as a metaphor or as a tool of sociological analysis. He took it as the physical law of the universe. Nature, he argued in Mein Kampf, always selects the strongest. The lion does not feed the wildebeest. Mercy does not exist in nature. Any social system based on mercy violates the natural order and condemns the civilization that practices it to degeneration and death. And Judaism, Hitler argued with terrifying logical coherence within its misguided premises, had perverted this natural order by introducing devastatingly subversive ideas that all human beings have intrinsic value, that the weak deserve mercy, that the rich have obligations to the poor, that war is an evil, that all men are brothers. Hitler identified these ideas with Judaism in Mein Kampf because he believed, with a perverse historical logic but not completely unfounded as to brute facts, that it was the biblical traditions that introduced this type of ethics to the Western world. Throughout the Old Testament, it declared that even the slave was made in the image of God. Through the New Testament, which for Hitler was nothing more than Reform Judaism that the West had mistakenly adopted. Through Marxism, which preached the equality of classes. Through political liberalism, with its emphasis on individual rights over natural hierarchies. And it must be taken seriously, however uncomfortable it may seem, that Hitler was partly consistent in this diagnosis. The ideas of human equality, of universal dignity, of care for the vulnerable do have their deepest historical roots in the traditions of Hebrew ethical monotheism. This is what makes Hitler's ideology so disturbingly different from other anti-Semitisms. He didn't just hate Jews as individuals or as a foreign group. He hated what Judaism had brought to the world. He hated ideas themselves. In his private conversations with Hermann Rauschning, president of the Danzig Senate before breaking with the Nazis, recorded in the book he published in 1939, Hitler said, "We fight Satan, we fight the Antichrist. Two worlds confront each other, the world of the man of God and the world of the man of Satan. The Jew is the anti-man, the creature of another God." This was the nature of Hitler's hatred. It wasn't envy, it was not personal resentment. It was, in his own mind, a cosmic crusade to save humanity from the ideas that were destroying it. Munich on the night of November 1923. About 3,000 armed men march from the Bürgerbraukeller brewery towards the city centre. At the front, Hitler with General Erich Ludendorff. The goal? To replicate Mussolini's march on Rome and overthrow the Bavarian government. The beer hall putsch was the most clumsy coup d'etat in modern German history. At 12 noon on November 9th, in front of the Feldherrenhalle, the Bavarian police opened fire on the marchers. 16 members of the Nazi Party and 4 policemen are killed. Hitler, who was walking arm in arm with businessman Max Erwin von Scheubner-Richter, fractures his shoulder when his companion falls dead next to him and drags him away. Fleeing the place, he is arrested 2 days later at the country house of his friends the Hanfstengel in Uffing am Staffelsee. Ludendorff, on the other hand, continued to march stoically at the head of the survivors until he was also arrested. The trial was an unexpected gift. Hitler turned it into a political platform of national scope, speaking for hours before a press that broadcast his words throughout Germany. The openly sympathetic judges sentenced him to 5 years of fortitude for high treason, the legal minimum penalty, instead of the deportation that befitted a foreigner. Hitler had not acquired German citizenship. He was still formally an Austrian citizen. Hitler entered the prison of Landsberg am Lech on April 1, 1924. In that prison, with its own room, access to the library, daily visits from admirers who brought him flowers and cakes, and the assistance of his secretary Rudolf Hess, Hitler dictated what would become the manual of the Third Reich, Mein Kampf. The first volume was published in July 1925 with the original title Mein Kampf, the second in December 1926. By 1933, 250,000 copies had been sold. By 1939, more than 5.5 million had been sold. It was the best-selling book in Germany after the Bible. Mein Kampf is cumbersome, repetitive, disorganized in parts. His writing reflects his oral origin. Hitler dictated, not wrote, and his style offers the tics of the popular orator, the redundant phrase, the reiteration for emphasis, the digression that abandons the argument to return to it from another angle. But its ideological content is perfectly coherent, and it has a central thesis that anyone could have read if they had wanted to see. The most important chapter is the 11th of the first volume, People and Race. In it, Hitler sets out his Darwinist vision of the universe. If nature did not want the strongest beings in the world to dominate the weakest, then weakness and not strength and energy would have to be proclaimed as a virtue. Nature, he continues, is an open book of racial wisdom. Animals do not mix between different races because natural selection punishes that mixing with infertility or weakness. Applied to humans, this means that breeds must preserve their purity or decay. The Aryan race is, according to Hitler, the founder of higher human culture. Every civilization worth living, every science, every art, every technology has its origin in it. When Aryan blood is mixed with inferior races, civilization inevitably decays. When that mixture reaches a point of no return, civilization disappears, and at the opposite extreme of the Aryan is the Jew. Hitler describes it not as inferior in the ordinary sense of the term, but as the anti-Aryan, the exact inverse. The Jew, he writes, lacks the instinct of sacrifice for the community that characterizes the Aryan. Its only law is individual survival. Their only allegiance is to their own race. It is, in the terminology that Hitler uses insistently, a parasite, an organism that lives inside a host body, that feeds on its resources, that progressively weakens it, and that cannot survive without it. From Landsberg prison, Hitler also planned the political strategy he would follow when he was released. He came to the conclusion that the road to power did not pass through the coup d'état, but through elections. That the party had to transform itself from a paramilitary group into a mass political force. That propaganda was the most powerful instrument available. And that the enemy to be destroyed was not only the Jew, but everything that the Jew, according to him, represented: Marxism, parliamentary democracy, egalitarianism. Hitler left Landsberg prison on December 20, 1924. He had served less than 9 months of his 5-year sentence. He had a book in his hands. He had a plan in his head. He was 8 years away from becoming Chancellor. January 1919. Hitler, still in the army, is tasked with infiltrating the German Workers' Party, a small Munich grouping that the military command suspects of Marxist tendencies. Hitler attends a meeting at the Sternecker Brau brewery. There are around 40 people. The party has a box with 7 marks and 50 pfennigs. What you hear is not Marxism. It is radical nationalism, folkish, anti-Semitic, anti-communist, and Hitler cannot contain himself. He intervenes in the debate with such passion and eloquence that the founder of the party, Anton Drexler, immediately invites him to join and shows him his own political pamphlet, Mein politisches Erwachen, My Political Awakening. In 2 years, Hitler has displaced Drexler and has become the undisputed leader. On February 24, 1920, in the Great Hall of the Hofbrauhaus in Munich, he announced the new name of the party, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, NSDAP. Before an audience of 2,000 people, he presents the 25-point program. The fourth point states, "Only anyone of German blood can be a member of the people, regardless of his religious confession. No Jew can, therefore, be a member of the people." Point 8 calls for preventing the immigration of non-Germans. Point 24 demands that the party combat the Jewish materialistic spirit. The party grew rapidly. He acquired the Völkische Beobachter, which became his press organ. He created the SA, his paramilitary stormtroopers, which would reach 3,000 members before the failed putsch of November 1923. He established a network of local chapters throughout Bavaria and then throughout Germany. Hitler's speeches were a physical experience. Conrad Hayden, one of his earliest biographers to meet him in person, described his voice as a guttural thunderclap, the very embodiment of power, steadfastness, command and will. The recordings that have survived show a precise and calculated rhetorical technique. He began slowly, almost whispering, constructing the narrative of German humiliation, then accelerated, raising emotional intensity. He reached a crescendo where the auditorium had become a melt with him. He never used humor to lighten up. He was the messenger of a cosmic crisis, and he transmitted it with all the resources of the mass orator. The putsch failed. The trial made him a national figure. Mein Kampf established him as the theoretician of the movement. And when he left Landsberg, he found a relatively stabilized Germany. Hyperinflation had been controlled by the new Reichsmark, American loans from the Dawes Plan. $400 million in 1924 were reviving the economy, and the Nazi Party lost seats in the December 1924 elections. But the prosperity did not last. In October 1929, the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange triggered the Great Depression. By 1932, Germany had 6 million officially registered unemployed. Banks failed, shops were closing. The middle class saw their life savings evaporate. The fear and humiliation that had followed 1918 returned with redoubled violence. In the July 1932 elections, the NSDAP won 37.4% of the vote, the best electoral result in its history. By then, the party was already the largest political force in Germany, a crucial factor that later analyses tend to minimize. The Nazis received support not from a single social sector, but from almost everyone. They received the vote of ruined peasants who had lost their farms, of artisans who could not compete with industrial production, of university students who saw a future closed before them, of small merchants who felt that the department stores, several of them in the hands of Jewish owners, were driving them out of the market. The historian Alan Confino points out that for different groups, the Jew represented different and often contradictory things. For some, he was the capitalist banker. For others, he was the Bolshevik agitator. For others, it was the cosmopolitan journalist who dissolved traditional values. The formidable image of the Jew as the origin of all evil was precisely that, an image flexible enough for each social sector to project onto it its own specific fears and resentments. The conservative right, led by Franz von Papen and the elderly President Paul von Hindenburg, made the fatal mistake of underestimating Hitler. Papen convinced Hindenburg to appoint him Chancellor on January 30, 1933, convinced that the conservative cabinet could control him. "In 2 months we'll have cornered him so much that he'll be screaming," Papen is credited with saying. He didn't scream. In 2 months he was dictator. January 30, 1933. Shortly after noon, German radio announces the appointment of Adolf Hitler as Reich Chancellor. At 8 o'clock in the evening, thousands of uniformed men in brown shirts march in a torchlight parade from the Tiergarten under the arch of the Brandenburg Gate along the Wilhelmstrasse. French Ambassador André-François Poncet watches the parade from the embassy. The torches they carried formed a river of fire, a river with rushing, unquenchable waves. Sebastian Haffner, a 25-year-old German writer, was on the street when the evening newspapers published the news. For about a minute, a glacial horror. It was so strange, so incredible to read it now in black and white. They were both right. The river of fire was real, and so was the horror. Hitler had arrived legally. No coup d'etat, no armed revolution. The Enabling Act of the 23rd of March 1933, which transferred full legislative powers to the Chancellor for 4 years, was passed in the Reichstag by 444 votes in favor and only 94 against. Only the Social Democrats present voted against it. The Communists had already been arrested, and the Catholic Centre Party supported the act in exchange for Hitler's promises to respect the rights of the Church. The Weimar Republic committed democratic suicide, and then began the methodical transformation of Germany into the racial state that Hitler had described in Mein Kampf. The speed was dizzying. According to historian Alon Confino, from January 31, 1933 to August 31, 1939, the Nazis and other Germans passed 1,448 legal measures to remove Jews from all aspects of German social, political, economic, and cultural life. In 1933 alone, 316 of these measures were enacted. By the time of the Nuremberg Laws in September 1935, 637 had already been passed. April 1, 1933, was the first organized boycott of Jewish businesses. SA men stood in front of the shops with signs, "Don't buy in Jewish establishments. Buying from Jewish businesses is a betrayal of the nation." Passers-by who entered were photographed for identification. In the courts of Breslau that same month, young Nazis broke into the courtrooms and physically expelled Jewish judges and lawyers. The president of the tribunal, standing idly by, he declared that of the 364 Jewish lawyers practicing in the city, only 17 would be allowed to enter the building. In Kreglingen, a town in Württemberg with 73 Jews among its few thousand inhabitants, members of the SA interrupted the Sabbath service in the synagogue on March 25, 1933, and forcibly removed 16 men. 2 did not survive. Hermann Stern, 67, and Arnold Rosenfeld, 52, died in their hometown, next to their longtime neighbors. The legislation came with flood speed. On April 7, 1933, the Professional Civil Service Restoration Act expelled all non-Aryans from public employment. On April 22, Jewish doctors were excluded from state social insurance. On April 25, the admission of Jewish students to universities was restricted to 1.5% of the total. The law of the Reich Chamber of Culture of September 1933 excluded Jews from all cultural activity. They could not publish, they could not compose music for the German public, they could not perform in theaters, they could not exhibit their paintings. On May 10, 1933, in 22 university towns simultaneously, German students and academics organized book burnings. At Berlin's Opernplatz, in front of 25,000 spectators, works by Sigmund Freud, Heinrich Heine, Karl Marx, Erich Maria Remarque, Kurt Tucholsky, Heinrich Mann, Rosa Luxemburg, Bertolt Brecht, Ernst Toller, Stefan Zweig, and many more were burned. Joseph Goebbels gave a speech in which he declared, "The era of exaggerated Jewish intellectualism is over." The poet Heinrich Heine, whose books burned on the pyre, had written a century earlier in his work Almansor, "Where books are burned, in the end people are also burned." In 1933, that phrase was burned along with his other texts. On November 10, 1938, the night of the pogroms known as Kristallnacht, the SA burned more than 900 synagogues throughout Germany and Austria, destroyed more than 7,000 Jewish businesses, killed at least 91 Jews on the same night, and arrested between 20 and 30,000 Jewish men who were sent to the Dachau concentration camps. Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. The next day, at the government meeting convened by Hermann Göring to assess the damage, the head of private insurance estimated that the cost of broken glass in the city of Berlin alone amounted to 24 million marks. Göring imposed a collective fine of 1 billion marks on the German Jewish community for the damage caused by his own persecutors. In Fürth, a city of 80,000 inhabitants in Bavaria, the SA gathered the entire Jewish community at Schlageter Platz, including 50 children from the orphanage and the sick from the hospital, and there, before the assembled public, they unfurled the Torah scrolls on the ground, forced the rabbis to walk on them, hung them from a pole, and set them on fire. The burning of the Hebrew Bible was not a spontaneous excess, it was the logical coherence of ideology. If the Jews were dangerous not because of their race, but because of the ideas they had introduced into the world, so the sacred text that contained those ideas was the deepest enemy. Before the extermination of the Jews began, the Nazi regime developed and perfected the techniques of mass murder in a program that affected German citizens who were not Jews. This program is not a historical accident or a marginal episode. It is the link that connects Hitler's racial ideology with the extermination camps. In 1939, Hitler issued a written authorization, dated retroactively to September 1, 1939, the day of the beginning of the war, in a gesture that reveals the association fixed in his mind between war and killing, which commissioned Philipp Buhler, head of the Führer's private chancellery, and Dr. Karl Brandt, his personal physician, to extend the authority of certain physicians so that persons who, in human judgment, are incurably ill may, upon the most critical evaluation of their medical condition, receive a merciful death. This was the authorization for the program that would be codenamed Action T4, named after the address of the Führer's chancellery at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. The T4 program systematically murdered patients in psychiatric hospitals and homes for the disabled throughout Germany. The mechanism was as follows. The doctors of the different centers filled out forms describing the diagnosis of each patient and their capacity for work. The forms were evaluated by commissions of experts, doctors and psychiatrists who marked with a red cross those who had to die and with a blue cross those who could live. Patients marked in red were transferred to one of 6 specially constructed extermination facilities: Bernburg, Brandenburg, Grafeneck, Hadamar, Hartheim, and Sonnenstein. There they were taken to gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, where they died from exposure to carbon monoxide. The bodies were cremated and families received a standard notification indicating a false cause of death, usually a fictitious illness or heart failure. By the time Hitler ordered the program to be stopped in August 1941, following protests by the Bishop of Münster Clemens August von Galen, whose homily against euthanasia was clandestinely broadcast throughout Germany, between 80,000 and 100,000 people had been killed. The program did not stop completely. It continued in a more decentralized and discreet way until the end of the war, adding tens of thousands of additional victims. The continuity between T4 and the Holocaust is not speculative. It is documentary. The same gas chambers used at Grafeneck and Brandenburg were literally dismantled, transported to Eastern Europe, and reassembled at the death camps of Belzec, Majdanek, and Treblinka. 92 employees of the T4 program were transferred directly to Operation Reinhard, the code name for the extermination of Jews in the Polish General Government. Christian Wirth, who he had supervised the operation of the gas chambers in the T4 centers, became the first commander of Belzec and then the Inspector General of the extermination camps of Operation Reinhard. Dr. Irmfried Ebel, who had headed the Brandenburg gas center, was the first commander of Treblinka. The techniques of deception were also transferred directly. The presentation of death as a hygienic shower, the confiscation of belongings before death, the cremation of bodies, the sending of false notifications to families. The bureaucracy of mass murder had been perfected in the bodies of German citizens themselves before being applied to the Jews of Europe. On January 30th, 1939, in the speech delivered in the Reichstag on the 6th anniversary of his appointment as Chancellor, Hitler uttered the words that he would repeat 4 more times during the war as if it were a sacred prophecy. Today I will be a prophet again. If international financial Jewry inside and outside Europe succeeds once more in plunging peoples into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the world and thus the victory of Judaism, but the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe. We must stop at this sentence. Hitler was not describing what Germany would do in the event of war. he was presenting the war itself, if it were to occur, as the occasion and justification for extermination. Conventional warfare and ideological warfare against the Jews were intertwined in his mind from the beginning. When the war came on September 1, 1939, with the invasion of Poland, the Einsatzgruppen followed the army. In September 1939, 6 of these special groups operated in Poland, committing massacres of Polish civilians, intellectuals, and community leaders. General Franz Halder noted in his diary the objectives transmitted by Reinhard Heydrich: cleanliness, Judaism, intelligentsia, clergy, nobility. But it was with the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, that the machinery of extermination reached its final form. 4 Einsatzgruppen, with a total of 3,000 men recruited from the SS, South Dakota, Gestapo, and the Police of Order, followed the German army groups in their advance through the Soviet territories. His verbal instructions, transmitted orally by Himmler to leave no written trace in that initial phase, were to kill all Jews, without exception, without distinction of sex, age, or condition. Einsatzgruppe A operated in the Baltic countries, in Kaunas, Lithuania, on June 25 and 26, 1941. Lithuanian paramilitary groups, encouraged by the Germans, perpetrated the Litukis Garage massacre, where some 68 Jewish men were beaten to death with iron bars, while hundreds of Lithuanian civilians were killed. They observed. German army photographer Wilhelm Gunsilius took the photographs, which survived and were presented as evidence in Nuremberg. Einsatzgruppe C, assigned to Army Group South that advanced through Ukraine, carried out the Babi Yar massacre in the ravine located on the outskirts of Kiev on September 29 and 30, 1941. Units of the Sonderkommando 4A under the command of SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel murdered 33,771 Jews in 48 hours. The victims had been summoned through advertisements in which they were told that they had to present themselves with their documents, money, valuables, and warm clothes. They walked in columns towards the ravine. There they were forced to hand over their belongings, undress, and lie down in the rows of corpses of those who had preceded them to be shot. The report of SS Standartenführer Karl Jaeger, head of an Einsatzkommando in the Baltic countries, presented in December 1941, documents with accounting precision the progress of the extermination in Lithuania. The document lists, locality by locality, date by date, the number of people killed divided by categories: Jewish men, Jewish women, Jewish children. By the 1st of December 1941, Jaeger's unit had murdered 137,346 people, of whom 55,556 were women and 34,464 were children. The report concludes, "Today I can confirm that the goal of solving the Jewish problem for Lithuania has been achieved by Einsatzkommando 3. On January 20, 1942, 15 senior officials of the Nazi state and the SS met in a 2-story villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. It was not a meeting to decide whether the Jews would be exterminated. That decision had already been made by Hitler and transmitted to Himmler in the summer of 1941, but to coordinate the administrative apparatus that would make possible the extermination of Jews throughout Europe. It was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, head of the RSHA, the Reich Central Security Office. The secretary was Adolf Eichmann. The act, discovered in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1947, lists in a table the European countries and the number of Jews to be eliminated in each. The total, 11 million people. The countries include not only those already under German rule, Ukraine, Poland, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, but also neutral and allied countries such as Sweden, 8,000 Jews, Spain, 6,000, Portugal, 3,000, and even Ireland, 4,000. England, 330,000. The Operation Reinhard death camps began operating in the spring of 1942. Belzec in southeastern Poland was the first, opened in March 1942, closed in December. Sobibor began operations in May 1942, Treblinka in July 1942. These three camps, along with Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek and Chelmno, became the 6 centers of industrial extermination of European Jewry. Treblinka, which operated from July 1942 to October 1943, received trains arriving several times a week from the Warsaw Ghetto and cities in eastern and central Poland. Convoys usually consisted of 60 hermetically sealed cattle wagons, each with 100 people inside. Heat, thirst, shortness of breath and fear produced a significant number of deaths during the journey, which could last several days. Upon arrival, the trains were uncoupled into groups of 20 wagons to enter the camp station. The guards opened the doors, shouting orders to come down quickly. The newcomers saw a station painted in bright colors, with schedules painted on the wall and a kiosk that sold tickets. It was a stage built to give the impression that this was a normal railway junction, not the end of the journey. From the arrival of the train to death in the gas chambers, disguised as shower rooms, exactly as in T4, the process lasted between 45 minutes and 2 hours. There was no selection between the fit and the unfit for the job. Everyone died. How many died? The most rigorous calculations based on pre- and post-war censuses, the records of the perpetrators themselves, and investigations in the decades since put the figure at 6 million Jews killed, 1 in 3 Jews in the world in 1939. The International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg concluded that approximately 2 million were killed by the Einsatzgruppen and other SS units. The other 4 million died in the extermination and concentration camps. The numbers by country reveal the geography of the genocide. Poland lost 91% of its Jewish community, 3.3 million people out of the 3.3 million who lived there before the war. The Netherlands lost 73%, Greece 69%, Yugoslavia 64%. Hungary 63%, of whom the vast majority were deported only between May and July 1944, when deportations from Budapest to Auschwitz reached the rate of 10,000 people per day. What these numbers don't capture is what each person represented. Emanuel Ringelblum, the historian who organized the clandestine archive known as Oneg Shabbat, died in the Warsaw Ghetto, buried in milk cans and metal crates to preserve the testimonies of the ghetto's life and death. In Auschwitz, in May 1944, the philosopher Joseph Louis Brackmann, aged 82, died. Janusz Korczak, the pedagogue who had founded the Jewish orphanage in Warsaw and refused all opportunities to save himself so as not to abandon his 200 children, died in Treblinka on August 5, 1942, with the children he had cared for decades. On April 29, 1945, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Hitler dictated in the bunker under the Reich Chancellery his final political testament. His last words to the German nation were, "Above all, I charge the leaders of the nation and those under them with the scrupulous observance of racial laws and implacable opposition to the universal poisoner of all peoples, international Jewry." The hatred that had moved him for 40 years, that he had transformed into state policy and that had cost 6 million lives, was still what had been the case. The last one he thought about before committing suicide with Eva Braun the next day, April 30th, 1945. Why is it important to understand Hitler's ideology beyond condemning it? Because the anti-Semitism that Hitler distilled and systematized was not a historical anomaly. It was the culmination of centuries of hostility that had traversed Europe in regular cycles, from the medieval massacres in which Jews were accused of poisoning wells during the Black Death, from the Hep Hep that toured Germany in 1819 with pogromic violence, from the Dreyfus affair in France, where a Jewish officer was falsely accused of treason, and the case divided the country between 1894 and 1906, since the Russian pogroms of the 19th century that led hundreds of thousands of Jews to emigrate. Hitler did not create European anti-Semitism, he industrialized it. Its ideology had an internal logic that made it extraordinarily resistant to refutation. If every German misfortune is a consequence of Jewish activity, Any argument that a Jew puts forward in his defense is, by definition, part of the conspiracy. If mercy is a Jewish invention to weaken the strong, any call for compassion toward the Jews is exactly the mechanism they designed to protect themselves. The system closes in on itself. It does not admit contrary evidence. And this is what makes ideologies of this kind so dangerous, not because they are irrational, but because they are coherent within their own false premises. And its premises are not empirically verifiable, but axiomatic. There is a reason why Jewish communities around the world, including American and Israeli, have preserved the memory of the Holocaust with such obsession and methodicality. It is not nostalgia for suffering, it's surveillance, because they know, with a knowledge that comes from the flesh and not just from the intellect, that what happened once can happen again. George Santayana wrote in 1905, "Those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it." The phrase has been repeated so much that it has lost its edge. The sheet must be returned. The past that has been narrated here did not occur on another planet or in another species. It happened in the heart of civilized Europe, in the country that had produced Goethe, Beethoven, and Kant, in a period of 12 years that begins with a legal appointment and ends with 6 million deaths. It was not inevitable. No catastrophe is. It was avoidable. And the only way for something like this not to happen again is to understand, without euphemisms and without shortcuts, how it worked. How systematic hatred is constructed, how institutions are gradually corrupted, how ordinary people become step by step accomplices of evil. Because the existence of those who survived, and of their descendants, and of all those who believe in the intrinsic dignity of every human being, is the most powerful response that exists to Hitler's worldview. We exist. We are still here. And that in itself is the ultimate refutation.